4 numbers suddenly appeared online, and the internet completely lost its mind. 528,000, 574,000, 493,000, 350,000. These weren't pulled from a Twitter poll or some random ESPN debate. They weren't born from viral moments or fan voting campaigns. These numbers came from official WNBA salary documents, the kind generated by algorithms, formulas, and contractual agreements that both players and the league signed off on. The second these figures hit social media, everyone had an opinion. Favoritism, sexism, market manipulation. The narrative exploded so fast that almost nobody bothered to ask the one question that actually matters. How did these numbers even get calculated in the first place? Because here's what most people don't realize. The salary gap between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese isn't a conspiracy. It's not evidence of a rigged system. It's actually proof of how the system works exactly the way it's supposed to. And once you understand the mechanism behind it, the entire conversation shifts. The drama, the controversy, the anger, it all starts to make a lot more sense. But there's something even bigger hiding in this story. Something that explains why brands have made decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars in completely different ways. Something that reveals what really separates these two players in the eyes of the professional world. The salary disparity between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese has become the centerpiece of one of the biggest debates in women's basketball over the past 2 years. But almost everyone discussing it is talking about the wrong thing. They're focusing on the gap itself, that $178,000 difference in base salary, when the real story is hidden inside the mechanism that created it. To understand what's actually happening, you have to look past the headlines and understand the system that generated those numbers in the first place. Because the system is the story, not the outcome, the system. When the WNBA renegotiated its collective bargaining agreement, the league faced a serious problem. The old structure was fundamentally broken. Under the previous system, players advanced through the salary structure at roughly the same pace, regardless of how they actually performed on the court. A woman could make 3 All-WNBA teams in her first 4 seasons and earn almost identical money to a player who simply stayed on the roster and collected a paycheck. The elite performers subsidized everyone else. Potential mattered more than production. Draft position mattered more than actual impact. And the league's most talented players had no financial incentive to produce at their highest level right out of the gate. The architects of the new CBA recognized this was unsustainable. Women's basketball needed a system that rewarded immediate excellence. Players who entered the league and produced at an elite level shouldn't wait years to be financially compensated for it. So they created something called the EPIC Clause, Exceptional Performance Incentive Clause. It's actually elegant in its simplicity. If you earn All-WNBA honors during your first 3 professional seasons, you get access to an accelerated salary pathway. You don't progress through the pay structure at the standard rate. You skip ahead. The league essentially says, you proved you belong at the highest level immediately. Your contract reflects that. Here's what makes this important. There is no room for interpretation. The threshold is unambiguous. It's not subjective. It's not dependent on social media followers or how many times your name trended on Twitter. It's not influenced by which player the algorithm decided to promote that week. It's built on one thing and one thing only: documented, verified All-WNBA selections made by a committee that evaluates actual production metrics. The selection committee doesn't vote based on potential or popularity. They assess how each player performed against every other player in the league. And once they make that determination, it becomes official. It becomes part of the salary calculation. When Caitlin Clark was drafted first overall in 2024, she entered the league as the most hyped prospect in WNBA history. But hype doesn't activate the EPIC Clause. Performance does. In her rookie season, Clark didn't just play well. She earned first-team All-WNBA honors. In her first year, that's extraordinarily rare. That triggered the clause immediately. The moment that selection was made official, her salary pathway changed. She jumped ahead. She wasn't going to progress through the contract structure like everyone else. The formula kicked in. The numbers were calculated. And that's how the salary gap was created. But here's what's crucial to understand. This clause has no favorite player. It has no preferred narrative. It applies to every single player in the league using the exact same criteria. If you earn All-WNBA honors, you get the accelerated pathway. If you don't, you don't. The clause doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care where you were drafted. It doesn't care about your Instagram followers. It cares about documented production that a committee of league experts verified and put their names on. The reason this matters so much is because it completely reframes how we should be thinking about the salary numbers. This isn't about favoritism. This isn't about the league trying to promote one player over another. This is about a system that was specifically designed to separate players who produce at an elite level immediately from players who don't. And the WNBA made a conscious decision to build that separation into the actual contract structure. They decided that immediate excellence should be immediately rewarded, not eventually, immediately. The $178,000 difference between Clark and Angel Reese isn't random. It's not arbitrary. It's the direct mathematical result of one player earning All-WNBA honors in her first year and another player not earning All-WNBA honors in her first 2 years. That's it. That's the entire explanation. You can debate whether the epic clause is the right approach. You can argue about whether the performance standards are fair. You can make legitimate points about the criteria the selection committee uses. But you cannot honestly claim that this is evidence of favoritism, because the same clause would have done the exact same thing for any player who earned All-WNBA honors in their first 3 seasons. The question is, how do we know? Because there's another player in this league who went through the exact same system under the exact same circumstances and received the exact same treatment. Her name is Aaliyah Boston, and her numbers tell you everything you need to know about whether this system is rigged. Aaliyah Boston's contract trajectory is the single most important piece of evidence in this entire conversation, because she proves that the epic clause works exactly the way it's supposed to, regardless of who the player is. Boston isn't Caitlin Clark. She doesn't have the same draft position. She doesn't have the same national profile. She doesn't have the same social media following. She's a completely different type of player with a completely different background. But when she went through the same system and met the same performance criteria, the system treated her the same way. And that's what eliminates the favoritism argument entirely. In her rookie season, Aaliyah Boston earned $94,000. That's the standard salary for a typical first-round pick entering the WNBA. It's not a remarkable figure. Thousands of players have made similar money in their rookie years. But Boston wasn't going to stay at $94,000 for long, because she had something that matters infinitely more than draft position or national profile. She had production, elite production. The kind that makes opponents change their entire defensive schemes just to try to contain you. Her first 2 professional seasons were consecutive All-WNBA selections. Back-to-back, that's not common. That means the league's evaluation committee looked at every player in the WNBA and decided Boston was one of the absolute best at her position for 2 straight years. When they made that determination official, something changed in her contract. The epic clause activated, and suddenly, her salary jumped from $94,000 to $574,000. That's a jump of $480,000 in a single transaction. That's not a gradual raise over time. That's not a year-by-year progression where you earn a little more each season. That's a contractual reclassification that happened because a committee verified documented All-WNBA production. The formula processed that information. The numbers came out, and Boston's entire professional value was formally recognized in her contract. But here's why Boston's case is so crucial to this conversation. It proves the system applies to every player consistently. Boston didn't benefit from some special treatment. She benefited from meeting the same threshold that Clark met. She produced at an elite level. The committee recognized it. The clause activated. The salary structure changed. It's not complicated. It's not controversial when you look at it objectively. It's a system responding exactly how it was designed to respond. The basketball analysts who watch Aaliyah Boston understand why the committee made that decision. When Indiana takes the court, Boston's presence fundamentally alters how opposing teams approach the game. The defensive coverage's opponents have to use change. The offensive post-entry angles shift. Every team in the league has to account for the defensive impact she creates when they're preparing to play against Indiana. Those decisions don't get made lightly by the selection committee. They're assessing how a player's presence affects the entire ecosystem of the game. Boston's impact on both sides of the court is profound. On offense, she changes where the ball can be safely entered into the paint. On defense, she changes the rebounding dynamics in ways that force teams to completely rethink their game plan. The selection committee is looking at this systemic influence when they're making All-WNBA decisions. They're not just looking at box scores. They're looking at how a player's presence creates cascading effects throughout their entire team's performance. When the committee made Boston's 2 consecutive All-WNBA selections official, they were saying, "This player produced at such an elite level that her presence literally changed how the entire league has to approach playing against her." That kind of impact deserves recognition. And in the new WNBA system, that recognition comes in the form of an accelerated salary pathway. Boston went from $94,000 to $574,000 because the system identified her as someone who produced at an elite level immediately. The most important thing about Boston's case is that it completely changes how we should think about Clark's case. If the system was rigged in Clark's favor, then it should have failed when applied to Boston. But it didn't. It worked perfectly. It identified another player who met the performance criteria, and it applied the same treatment. Same clause, same process, same result, different player, different background, different draft position, same system response. This is the moment where the favoritism argument dies. Because you cannot claim a system is rigged in one player's favor when the exact same system applies to a completely different player and produces proportional results. Boston's numbers prove that the epic clause is functioning as intended. It's identifying players who produce at an elite level and accelerating their salary growth. That's what it's supposed to do. That's exactly what it did. And if that's what it's doing, then we need to ask a different question entirely. If the system is fair and functioning correctly, then why did Angel Reese's salary not accelerate the same way? The answer to that question is uncomfortable for everyone who's been defending Reese's public narrative. Angel Reese was selected 7th overall in the 2024 WNBA draft. That's a significant draft position. That's first-round territory. That gives you a real advantage in the salary structure compared to players selected later. The draft slot itself carries weight in the new CBA. It's not everything, but it's something. Reese's draft position took her from the standard rookie minimum and placed her above the baseline. She started at $350,000 as a professional basketball player. That's a solid foundation. That's more than most rookies make. But here's where this gets really uncomfortable for anyone arguing that the system is rigged against Reese. She wasn't the only player in her draft class. And in the 2 seasons since that draft, her peers have moved past her. Cameron Brink was selected 2nd overall, 2 spots ahead of the typical rookie baseline, but Brink's contract didn't just stay at a slightly higher number than Reese's. Brink is currently valued at $493,000. That's $143,000 more than Reese. Same draft year, same rookie cohort, different trajectory. Brink earned that difference through All-WNBA production in her first season. She met the epic clause threshold. Reese did not. Then there's Sonia Kitchell, the 3rd overall pick. Kitchell is valued at $436,000. That's $86,000 more than Reese. Again, same draft class. Same amount of professional experience. Different results. Kitchell produced at a level that earned All-WNBA recognition. Reese did not. This is the data point that really undermines any narrative that positions Reese as a victim of an unfair system. Because Reese isn't falling behind Clark. That comparison is misleading because Clark was in a different draft class with different circumstances. The real comparison is Reese versus her own peers. Reese versus the players she came into the league with. And in that comparison, Reese is underperforming. She was selected 7th overall, and 2 of her own draft mates who were selected ahead of her have moved further up the contract ladder. Both of them earned All-WNBA honors. Both of them triggered the epic clause. Both of them have higher salaries. Reese has not earned All-WNBA honors in 2 complete professional seasons. Not first team, not second team, not third team. She hasn't been named to any All-WNBA team at all. This isn't a media narrative. This isn't opinion. This is a decision made by the league's evaluation committee using predetermined criteria to assess production metrics. The committee looks at every player in the league. They evaluate who performed at the highest level. And for 2 straight years, they did not identify Reese as one of those players. That's not a conspiracy. That's an assessment made by basketball experts who watch every single game and evaluate every single player using the same criteria. Now, the timing of when Reese decided to speak out publicly about the salary gap is worth noting. The information about these salary numbers became public in the same week that Reese decided to voice her complaints most vocally. She looked at those numbers. She saw the difference between her salary and Clark's salary. And she used that as a platform to discuss inequality in women's basketball. But here's what that timing actually reveals. It reveals that Reese was responding to a salary document. She wasn't responding to actual analysis of why the salaries were different. She was responding to numbers on a page without understanding the mechanism that created them. Her argument would have been much stronger if she had taken time to understand how those numbers were actually generated. Because the moment you understand the epic clause, the moment you understand that the salary difference is tied directly to All-WNBA production, the entire narrative changes. You're no longer discussing inequality. You're discussing a system that's working exactly as intended. And if you want to make a legitimate argument about fairness, you have to grapple with the reality of your own production numbers. You have to acknowledge that the evaluation committee looked at your performance and did not identify you as an elite performer. You have to ask yourself what specific production metrics were lacking. You have to look at the actual basketball statistics and figure out where the gap exists. But that's a much harder conversation to have than simply pointing at a salary number and claiming it's unfair. That's the kind of analysis that requires humility. That requires acknowledging areas where production fell short of expectations. That requires examining on-court metrics that don't tell a flattering story. Reese's public response indicates that she hasn't done that analysis. And the way she responded to these numbers actually reveals something important about her approach to dealing with setbacks. The salary document was supposed to be neutral. It wasn't supposed to favor anyone. It wasn't supposed to carry any narrative. It was just supposed to be math. But when Reese saw those numbers, she chose to interpret them through the lens of inequality rather than through the lens of performance. That choice, that interpretation, that response, it matters more than the numbers themselves, because it reveals how someone handles failure when the numbers are undeniable. To understand why the evaluation committee did not name Angel Reese to any All-WNBA team in her first 2 professional seasons, you have to look at what the committee actually evaluates, because it's not what most casual fans think they're looking at. The committee isn't just reading box scores. They're conducting a deeper analysis of how a player's presence affects the game. The narrative around Reese's first 2 professional seasons has been framed as improvement. The box score totals looked significant on the surface. She was rebounding at rates that attracted attention in the media. She was constantly in the conversation about high rebound performances. But the moment you dig deeper into the underlying data, the picture becomes much more nuanced. And it starts to explain why elite evaluation committees looked at her production and made a different assessment than social media did. A significant portion of Reese's offensive rebound totals came from her own missed field goal attempts. When you're tracking rebound credit, there's an important distinction between getting a rebound off someone else's miss versus getting a rebound off your own miss. Both are credited to you on the stat sheet, but they tell very different stories about efficiency and production quality. Reese was credited with rebounds that were directly linked to her own shooting struggles. That's not the kind of production that the All-WNBA committee is looking for. Her overall field goal percentage in her second season was 39%. That's well below the league standard. When she was within 5 feet of the basket, in other words, when she had a high-quality scoring opportunity, her conversion rate was less than 50%. Less than 50%. From 5 feet and closer. From 3 to 5 feet, which is one of the highest percentage shooting zones in basketball, Reese was struggling. Then when you look at her shooting efficiency from 5 to 9 feet, it dropped to 13%. That's not a minor problem. That's a structural issue in her offensive game. To put this in perspective, Reese attempted the third highest number of layups in the entire WNBA during that season. Third highest volume of layup attempts, but her layup conversion rate was only 31%. In a league where layups are supposed to be the highest percentage shot, she was converting at rates that suggest serious inefficiency at the rim. When you're getting close to the basket and you're only making 31% of your layups, something is structurally wrong with how you're finishing. And opposing defenses know this. They recognize it. They account for it in their defensive planning. This is where the All-WNBA evaluation process becomes important. The selection committee isn't just looking at the number of rebounds. They're looking at what created those rebounding opportunities in the first place. They're looking at the shot quality that generated the misses. They're looking at whether a player's presence is improving their teammates' efficiency or creating chaos. The committee evaluates the entire offensive ecosystem. When you look at the rebounding totals in isolation, they look impressive. When you look at the missed shots that created those rebounds, the picture becomes completely different. The rebounds didn't represent elite defensive effort or superior positioning. They represented her team missing shots because Reese was unable to convert at the rim, and then she was able to get those rebounds because she was already positioned near the basket where she had just missed. The box score doesn't tell that story, but the evaluation committee knows how to read behind the numbers. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark was producing a completely different type of basketball impact. Clark wasn't the leading rebounder. She wasn't padding her stats. She was creating conditions on the floor that made her entire team better in ways that don't always show up in her individual stat line. Clark's presence fundamentally altered how defenses had to construct their game plans. Because she could shoot three-pointers at an elite level and create for others, opposing teams couldn't just focus on stopping her individually. They had to build defensive schemes that accounted for her gravitational impact. She was diverting attention. She was clearing driving lanes for her teammates. She was opening post-entry angles for bigger players. The defensive urgency required to keep her honest was creating opportunities for everyone else on the court. Aaliyah Boston specifically benefited from playing alongside Clark. Boston got cleaner looks in the post because defenses couldn't relax their perimeter attention. Kelsey Mitchell got more driving lanes because the floor was more spread out. Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hull got more open three-point opportunities because two defenders were frequently following Clark without the ball. This type of gravitational offensive impact doesn't show up in Clark's shooting percentage. It doesn't show up in her points per game. It doesn't show up in her assist totals, though those are elite too. It shows up in the performance of her teammates. It shows up in Indiana's win totals. It shows up in the way every opposing coaching staff has to completely rethink their defensive approach before playing against her. The All-WNBA Selection Committee assesses precisely this type of systemic influence. They're looking at how a player's presence affects both the offensive and defensive performance of the entire team. And Clark's impact was so significant in her rookie year that the committee unhesitatingly placed her on the first team. Reese's impact told a different story. The data showed that her team's offensive efficiency issues were linked to her own inefficiency at the rim, not to elite rebounding that was creating second-chance opportunities. The All-WNBA committee made a decision based on that data. The evaluation was consistent with how the system works, and the salary difference was the direct result of that evaluation. The salary numbers that sparked this entire conversation are important, but they're almost insignificant compared to what's happening simultaneously in the endorsement market. Because while the WNBA salary gap is measured in tens of thousands of dollars, the endorsement gap between these two players is measured in tens of millions. And the endorsement market tells a much clearer story about actual commercial value. Nike made a decision that shocked the sports world. They offered Caitlin Clark an 8-year, $28 million footwear collaboration. 8 years, $28 million. Think about that for a moment. Nike doesn't make decisions like this based on viral moments or trending hashtags. They don't do it because a player has a big social media following. They do it because they've identified a commercial asset that appeals to different generations and has the potential to drive retail sales at a velocity and scale that justifies a long-term investment. Nike has been in the business of finding these assets for over 40 years. They have data on what successful athlete endorsements look like at the beginning of a career. They have actuarial models. They have retail tracking systems. They know what it looks like when an athlete's name actually influences consumer behavior on a large scale. And they examined Caitlin Clark's first 2 professional seasons before committing to this deal. They looked at television ratings. They looked at arena attendance. They looked at merchandise velocity. They looked at movement in the market over her first 2 years of professional play. And then they decided that the data justified an 8-year commitment. That's not an experiment in marketing. That's a firm wager from the most advanced shoe company in professional sports history. Gatorade took a different approach, but the underlying decision was the same. They didn't just sign Clark to a typical endorsement contract. Their partnership is reportedly worth around $50 million, and it's not a simple agreement where Gatorade pays Clark to appear in commercials. They created an entirely new product line around her. They developed a signature flavor called Rainbow 3. It's a branded product specifically tied to Clark's name. When those rainbow bottles went on sale, they sold out so quickly that it created an actual news cycle completely independent of basketball. People were talking about how fast the bottles were flying off shelves. Retail outlets couldn't keep them in stock. The velocity of that sellout was unprecedented. And according to sources familiar with the promotion, even Gatorade's most bullish internal estimates were shocked by how quickly the product moved. Here's what's important about that. Gatorade doesn't create signature flavors for every athlete who has a big social media following. They don't do it for players who are popular online. They do it for athletes whose names produce demonstrable consumer demand at a velocity and scale that their distribution system can actually track in real time. Clark's name did that. The sellout velocity proved it. And the fact that the sellout exceeded even Gatorade's internal expectations revealed something significant about the actual demand for products tied to Clark's brand. State Farm approached the Clark partnership from a completely different angle. This is an insurance company with more than a century of advertising history. They've been building national advertising campaigns since 1922. They've been operating through every major cultural shift in American sports and media, television, cable, the internet, social media transformation. And in all that time, they had never once anchored a national advertising campaign around a female athlete. A 100-year-old strategy came to an end when Caitlin Clark's commercial data hit their desk. State Farm is not a fashionable company trying to go viral. They don't make decisions based on trend forecasting. They're an insurance company that uses actuarial forecasts for all of its operations. Actuaries look at data. Cold, hard numbers. When the commercial data associated with Clark reached their analytics department, it was so compelling that they made a decision to fundamentally alter the advertising strategy they had used for over a century. That decision wasn't made lightly. That decision wasn't made because Clark was interesting or because she was getting good press. It was made because the data indicated she was a sound financial investment for a major brand partnership. Wilson Sporting Goods created an entire signature product line around Clark. That's a massive endorsement decision. And historically, Wilson has only done this once in their entire corporate history. They did it for Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is not a current WNBA player. Michael Jordan is not another active athlete getting championship-level attention. Michael Jordan is the most commercially dominant athlete in professional basketball history. Wilson looked through their entire catalog of brand partnerships spanning more than a century of business history, and they concluded that Clark's commercial polling justified doing what they last did for Michael Jordan. When you step back and look at the complete portfolio, Nike, Gatorade, State Farm, Wilson, you're looking at combined commitments worth over $100 million. And every single one of these brands had alternatives. Every single one of them could have chosen to partner with other players. Every single one of them assessed the options and selected Clark. The business community does not make collective decisions worth $100 million based on social media metrics or sentiment analysis. It makes them based on actual data. And the market's reaction to Clark's name throughout her first 2 professional seasons was genuinely unprecedented in women's basketball. In the middle of all this unprecedented brand investment in Caitlin Clark, Reebok launched a signature shoe line with Angel Reese. They invested real money. They developed the distribution infrastructure. They carried out a marketing campaign with genuine promotional drive. They put real resources behind the collaboration. And then something happened that tells you everything you need to know about how the market actually values these 2 players. The shoe sat on shelves. Not because of bad timing, not because of bad luck, not because of external market conditions. The shoe didn't sell through at the rate that would justify the investment Reebok had made. And when that happened, the marketing team received a very clear signal from the sales data. And that signal came through the retail numbers. And the response was immediate and unmistakable. The marketing budget began contracting quietly. Advertisements that had been running stopped running. The follow-up campaign announcements that typically come after a successful shoe launch simply didn't happen. The shoe slid into discounted retail positioning as Reebok went almost completely silent on the entire promotion. The company essentially pulled back from the partnership in a way that was impossible to miss if you were paying attention to the commercial space. Brands do not let campaigns go silent when those collaborations are performing well. When a shoe is selling at the velocity required to justify the initial investment, brands do not reduce spend. They increase spend. They build on momentum. They announce follow-up products. They put the athlete in more campaigns, not fewer. They double down on what's working. Silence in the endorsement world is not a neutral signal. It is not a quiet retreat from a failed experiment. It is a straightforward statement from the sales data to the marketing team that the investment is not generating the return that the brand needed it to generate. The transition from launch momentum to retail markdown is one of the most lucid market judgments available in the current WNBA endorsement landscape. Because it's pure data. It's not opinion. It's not narrative. It's not commentary. It's what actually happened when real consumers made real purchasing decisions based on whether or not they wanted to buy an Angel Reese signature shoe. And Reebok learned something through that sales data that the launch energy had initially hidden. They learned what Reese's actual name value is in the commercial marketplace. They learned whether her brand could move product at the scale that justifies major partnership investments. And the answer they received through the retail data was clear enough that they reorganized their marketing approach around that information. The business community had been watching this entire scenario unfold. They were monitoring what happened when major brands partnered with these 2 players. They were tracking whether those partnerships translated into actual consumer demand. And the contrast between the Nike Gatorade State Farm Wilson approach to Clark and the Reebok trajectory with Reese could not have been more stark. On one side, you have unprecedented levels of brand investment. You have companies breaking century-old traditions. You have products selling out faster than anticipated. You have brand extensions and signature product lines. You have penetration into cultural spaces completely unrelated to basketball. On the other side, you have a brand that quietly withdrew its marketing support and moved the product to discounted retail positioning. This wasn't random. This wasn't about luck. This was about how the marketplace responds to 2 different commercial assets. And the marketplace made a clear determination about which one was generating actual consumer demand and which one wasn't. The moment that Reebok's marketing budget began contracting, every other brand paying attention to the endorsement space received a message. That message was, watch the sales data, not the hype. Watch what actually translates into consumer purchases. Watch whether the player's name influences buying decisions at scale. Reebok's silence was instructive. It was a demonstration of what happens when the commercial data doesn't support the narrative. When Forbes released its ranking of the most influential women in sports, Caitlin Clark landed at number 4. That ranking isn't determined by fan voting. It's not determined by engagement metrics or social media activity. It's determined by a specific data methodology that examines brand impact measurements and income generation. Forbes looked at documented commercial influence. They examined whether a player's name translated into measurable financial outcomes. And based on that analysis, they identified Clark as the fourth most influential woman in sports. Simultaneously, Sportico released its own ranking of the most influential athletes of 2025. They used a similar data-first methodology. And in that ranking, they named Caitlin Clark the most influential female athlete of the year. The reason Clark ranked so highly on both of these lists at the same time wasn't because of publicity or because she was trending. It was because her name was actually associated with unprecedented commercial figures. The data was telling a consistent story across multiple independent analyses. The commercial world was noticing something that transcended basketball entirely. Caitlin Clark's cultural influence had extended into spaces that had nothing to do with sports. That's when the fashion world became relevant to this story. Prada held a runway show. It was the kind of high-fashion event that defines cultural moments. The front row of a Prada show is reserved for cultural icons at the absolute pinnacle of their influence. Prada doesn't give front row seats to anyone who asks. They don't give them to players who are trendy or famous. They give them to individuals who sell the brand's merchandise and create valuable press. Caitlin Clark got a front row seat at a Prada runway show, sitting alongside cultural icons. At that level of fashion visibility, that seat wasn't a courtesy placement. That was a recognition that Clark's cultural influence had reached a level where her presence at a fashion event carried commercial value, where her name attached to a brand mattered in markets completely unrelated to basketball. But here's what happened next. And this is where the story becomes really instructive about how these two players actually operate in the public sphere. Angel Reese noticed that Clark got that Prada seat. Reese noticed the Forbes ranking. Reese noticed the Sportico designation. And Reese's response followed a pattern that had started years earlier, back when they were still in college. The pattern is remarkably consistent. When Clark receives recognition or achieves something significant, Reese's public response is characterized by contempt, not constructive commentary, not thoughtful analysis, not acknowledgement of different paths. Contempt. And that response pattern has remained unchanged from the college period all the way into the professional era. The commercial world tracks this behavior. Brands specifically monitor how athletes respond to setbacks and how they conduct themselves in public spaces. They analyze sentiment. They look at whether an athlete's public conduct eventually shifts toward taking responsibility. They assess whether someone demonstrates professionalism and stability in the face of competitive hardship. Because when a brand is committing $50 million or $28 million or entering into century-old advertising traditions around a player, they need to know that the athlete won't create liability events that damage the brand's reputation. For the better part of 2 complete professional seasons, Reese's performance on this particular metric, how she handles adversity, how she responds to recognition of others, how she conducts herself in public, has consistently been unfavorable. And the commercial world has been slowly shifting its positioning around that reality. It's not something you notice in one moment. It's a cumulative repositioning that happens as brands make individual partnership decisions and gradually reduce their exposure to potential liability. Every time Reese has initiated public altercations over the past 2 years, Clark's response has been virtually identical. Play basketball at a level that results in All-WNBA selections. Represent Team USA at the highest competitive level. Form new brand alliances. Conduct interviews that reinforce the perception of someone who is solely focused on output and performance. The consistency of that response isn't accidental. It goes beyond effective public relations. It's a quantifiable and distinct business asset. The athletes that brands want to invest $50 million into are the ones who can be counted on to handle pressure with professionalism. The ones who don't create controversy. The ones who respond to public drama by producing at an even higher level. The ones who don't give critics more ammunition by engaging in the exact kind of behavior that's feeding the criticism in the first place. When you're committing nearly $100 million in combined endorsement deals, you need certainty. You need to know that the athlete you're investing in won't cause you problems. You need evidence that they can handle public scrutiny without lashing out. You need to see a pattern of professional decision-making, especially in moments when emotions are running high. Clark's public record has consistently provided that evidence. Reese's public record has provided the opposite. This is where the story goes beyond basketball and beyond salary disputes. This is where it becomes about how professional athletes are actually evaluated by the business community. Because the endorsement decisions that generate $100 million commitments aren't made based on popularity or social media metrics or even raw athletic talent. They're made based on risk assessment. When brands invest that kind of capital into an athlete, they're not just buying their performance on the court. They're buying access to that person's image. They're tying their corporate identity to that person's public behavior. They're making a bet that the athlete will conduct themselves in a way that doesn't create embarrassing associations with the brand. The bigger the investment, the more critical that calculation becomes. Every comment Angel Reese makes in public is being monitored by sponsors who are currently assessing her long-term commercial potential. Every response to criticism, every reaction to recognition of others, every public statement about competitors, all of it is being tracked and analyzed, because sentiment analysis is a measurable discipline. Brands employ people who monitor how an athlete's public behavior influences the perception of brands that are commercially linked with them. And the tracking of Reese's public conduct over the course of 2 professional seasons has revealed a pattern that's difficult for commercial partners to ignore. The pattern is one where public altercations have been initiated frequently, where responses to achievements of others have been characterized by negativity, where professional adversity has sometimes been met with public blame shifting rather than accountability, where the athlete's public record creates risk for brands that are associating their identity with that of the player. That's not a judgment about character. That's an assessment based on observable public behavior. And commercial decision-makers have to make those assessments. They don't have the luxury of assuming that an athlete will eventually grow out of a pattern. They have to look at evidence of current behavior and make projections about future behavior. And the evidence available in Reese's public record isn't encouraging to brands considering major investments. Caitlin Clark's public record tells a different story. Every time Reese has tried to initiate public altercations, Clark's response has been consistent. She doesn't engage in public disputes. She doesn't create drama for the sake of creating drama. She doesn't use social media to amplify conflicts. What she does is channel all of that energy into basketball performance and brand development. When the Forbes ranking came out and placed her 4th among influential women in sports, did Clark engage in public disputes with other athletes about why she was ranked where she was? No, she let the data speak. When the Reebok situation developed differently than the Gatorade situation, did Clark make public comments about that? No, she continued to produce at a high level and maintained professional partnerships. That behavioral consistency is what makes $50 million and $28 million and State Farm's century-old advertising strategy change seem rational from a corporate perspective. Because it's not just about basketball. It's about the person behind the basketball. It's about what that person does when they're faced with criticism. It's about how that person conducts themselves when dealing with competitive hardship. It's about whether that person represents a stable, long-term investment or a potential liability. Every major endorsement decision made by Nike, Gatorade, State Farm, and Wilson has been made with this calculation in mind. These are companies that have been operating for decades. They have deep experience with athlete partnerships. They have seen how public behavior can suddenly create problems for brand partnerships. They have insurance and legal teams that specifically analyze whether partnering with a particular athlete creates elevated risk. The fact that all 4 of these major brands made simultaneous investments in Caitlin Clark isn't coincidental. It's not as if these companies didn't know about each other's plans. It's not as if they weren't aware that other major brands were also making large commitments. What they were all responding to was the same underlying assessment. This athlete's public behavior profile indicates a relatively low-risk, high-reward investment from a brand partnership perspective. That calculation has to be made. Because if a brand invests $50 million and then an athlete engages in public conduct that damages the brand's reputation, that's a massive financial loss. It's not just the money spent on endorsement payments. It's the damage to the brand's image. It's the cleanup required. It's the distancing that has to happen publicly. It's the entire partnership essentially unraveling in ways that cost far more than the initial investment. The commercial world protects itself against that risk by doing exactly what these major brands did. They look at an athlete's entire public record. They assess how that athlete has handled adversity, criticism, and recognition of competitors. They evaluate whether that athlete demonstrates professional stability and sound judgment in public spaces. And then they make their investment decisions based on that comprehensive assessment. Reese's path has been different. She's received less of that kind of major brand investment, and it's not because she hasn't worked hard. It's not because she's not a good basketball player. It's because the commercial calculation has been different. The data has pointed in different directions. The risk profile has been higher, and the market has responded accordingly. The salary documents that sparked this entire conversation are just the most visible part of a much larger story about how markets actually function. The WNBA salary gap exists because of documented basketball production, but the endorsement gap exists because of something broader. It's about professional conduct. It's about how someone responds to setbacks. It's about whether someone represents a stable, secure investment or a potential liability. The 4 salary numbers that set the internet on fire weren't evidence of favoritism or a rigged system. They were proof that the WNBA's epic clause is working exactly as it was designed to work. Players who earn All-WNBA honors in their first 3 seasons get accelerated salary growth. Caitlin Clark earned first-team honors as a rookie. Angel Reese hasn't earned any All-WNBA honors in 2 seasons. That's the entire explanation. But the real story isn't about the salary gap. It's about what's happening simultaneously in the endorsement market, where the gap is measured in tens of millions instead of tens of thousands. Nike, Gatorade, State Farm, and Wilson didn't make unprecedented investments in Clark because of hype. They made those investments because data showed that her name influences consumer behavior at scale. Meanwhile, Reebok's silence reveals what happens when that data tells a different story. The market doesn't lie. It responds to measurable production and professional conduct. It rewards athletes who handle adversity with grace and respond to setbacks with improved performance. It penalizes athletes who create public drama and respond to recognition of others with contempt. These aren't moral judgments. They're commercial realities. Reese's $1 million demand narrative misses the point entirely. The issue isn't what the WNBA is paying her. The issue is what the broader market has determined her actual value to be based on documented evidence of performance and conduct. And that determination has been remarkably consistent across multiple independent analyses and brand partnership decisions. The market has spoken. And the message isn't coded in salary documents. It's written in retail numbers, viewership data, and brand investment decisions. That's the story everyone should be paying attention to.